he's really such an unusual person. And I'm lucky that he and I are friends. So all of these things, what I just told you now, I won't embarrass him by telling him that he was this, not just a child prodigy, but just simply an amazing child prodigy, so much so that he was known in an entire city, and my guess is around the country. And I know this, of course, not from him. I know this from friends, mutual friends. He would never talk about it. And his friends never
So how did you meet him? How did you get to know him?
I'll mention it, but what happened was, I don't know how it happened, but I was invited to a conference in Brazil. It was the Latin American School for Neuroscience, Cognitive Science, and Education. Somehow I got invited to it. I'm not sure how it happened. And the first day that I was there, I met him, and that was it. It was a click. We really enjoyed each other's company a lot. And I thought at the time it was, they brought in, this is, I'm not putting myself in the category, but they brought really major figures in the fields of brain science, cognitive science, and education. And the faculty, there were faculty and postdocs and people close to finishing their PhDs. And there was like half and half faculty, about 20 of us, and half students, about 20, 25. It was really something wonderful. And I thought, this is so, and the meeting was for 2 weeks, which is unusual. And I thought, well, and I'd heard you don't get invited a second time. So I said, oh boy, I'm gonna stay here for the entire 2 weeks and hear these incredible faculty members, some of whom I knew, and some I knew from the literature, and bright young students. So what could be better? So I stayed for the 2 weeks. And to my enormous surprise, I was invited a second time. And Mariano was there. And the second time, I had the same thing. I thought, I won't get invited again, so I'll stay another 2 weeks again. Terrific, really wonderful. It's called the school. And that happened a third time. So I started to develop magical thinking, which was that if I say that I'm going to stay for the full 2 weeks, I'll get invited the following year. In any event, I had many opportunities to be with Mariano, and we spent really a lot of time together, watching, talking science, of course, and the usual things, including watching a World Cup match together, all sorts of things. And he also came to Israel and stayed with me at my place, probably for 4 or 5 days, something like that. It might have been even more. But whatever it wasn't enough. He's just really fascinating beyond measure. So I got invited to this LA, Latin American school, and I was invited like 7 times, something like that, each year. So that's how I got to meet him. I met his students, and I'm in touch with his students as well to this day. He's received many awards, really serious awards. So clearly a mind that's rich, that runs deep, that covers many areas: biology, mathematics, engineering. He was involved in building some kind of a machine for measuring brain activity, the brain sciences. As I said, magic, religion, gastronomy. So he's not your average, faculty member scientist.
Very true, sir. Totally fascinating.
And I won't mention this when they introduce him, but he's a very good friend, and not just with me, but with all the people who he's been friends with much longer than the friendship that he and I have. He's a loyal and concerned friend who keeps up with what's happening with you. So, everybody is unique, as you know. And then there's some people who are uniquer, really something special, and you know that you're in the presence of an extraordinary human being. But there's some who stand out in many. So Mariano is one of those.
Actually,
Well,
now I wish all our speakers come in late. We get to know so much about them, which we normally don't. We just come and listen to the talk. But the fact that today he's a bit late, we really got to get insights about him as a person as well.
Yeah, no. Yeah, when you introduce somebody, you usually don't say the kinds of things that I'm talking about now. And there's another thing, which is that I've had the good fortune of speaking with 4 Nobel Prize winners, and not just hello, good day, or something like that, but sometimes extended conversations. Mariano puts them in his back pocket. And Nobel Prize winners are not slouches, to say the least. Mariano has just an exceptional mind. It's something to behold. So what a pleasure. So let me see if he's written something. Kripa, are you there?
Yes.
Okay, can you do me a favor? I just got from Chur, I just got a note a couple of minutes ago that he cannot connect. So I don't know if he's here or not.
He is
I
here.
don't see him. Sure, are you here? Yeah, okay. So sure, if you're here, you connected. If he's not here, and I don't see him, if he's not here, could you do me a favor, Kripa, and send him the link? He might be using the link from the earlier time, from the what are we supposed to do?
No, it was the same. It was the same link. I just changed the time on it. Sir, can you hear? Because it shows in the participant list that he's connected. Oh, no, now
I'm
he's
here.
Okay.
Okay, great.
I was just, I'm sorry, I was just on another Zoom that was, anyways, I'm here.
Okay, fine.
Sid, did you ask me something? I'm really sorry.
No, I guess your WhatsApp is saying that you couldn't connect.
No, I could connect. But somebody wrote that he was not able to connect, so I just replied with to try that one. Somebody else said he couldn't connect. I don't know.
Okay.
Nucci.
Okay.
Nushri or something. So I just because I couldn't find the link, I'd put it, closer to the question.
Okay.
So he should be able. I don't know why he's not responding there. Okay. He cannot. I don't know. I don't know why. But I have to say that I've read Mariano's some of his work, and it's really astonishing. It's phenomenal.
Yeah. He's a young man and has really made his mark in a number of areas, academic areas.
It's also very very tough research area. It's crowded with people, and it's really hard to kind of be the spot.
Hello? Hello?
Hey!
Sydney.
Here he is.
How are you?
Oh, Mariano, it was good seeing you, to say the least.
Sorry? Say again.
I said wonderful seeing you, to say the
Wonderful.
least.
Yeah, wonderful to see you too. The sound is not so good. I couldn't understand you very well. I'm so sorry I was late. It's completely impossible these days.
No problem. I explained to people what the problem was, and the fact that you're a good father, a good dad, taking your kids to school. So I gave Mariano, the people some of the background about you, but I'll say a few words and add what it was that to what it was that I already said. So Mariano started off in Spain. For all kinds of reasons, his family moved to Argentina, where he grew up. Here he is back again in Spain, but he also spent time in Paris, where he did postdoctoral work. His PhD, his training as a physicist, and he got his PhD at Rockefeller University in the brain sciences. And he was wondering where he should go to do a postdoc. And he ended up, for interesting reasons, he told me about, he ended up in Paris in Stan Dehaen's lab. For those who don't know Stan or about him, so Stanislas Dehaene is one of the top, if not the top person in the brain sciences and cognition. And so, Mariano, I'm going to tell you something that I don't know if he ever told you, but I'll tell you what he told me. And that is, he said, because he's really top, Stan, he said, I get all kinds of doctoral students and postdoc students, and they're superb. They're really superb. And then there's Mariano, who is so many levels above superb. And they're all wonderful, all these people who worked with me. But when Mariano came on the scene, there was just something else that was happening at another level altogether. So I mentioned, Mariano, somebody asked me how I came to know you. And I said, well, I was invited to a meeting in Brazil for the LA school. I said, but absolutely no idea how I got invited to it, why I got invited. But the first day in Brazil, when I was there at the conference, you and I, by chance, met at a poster session, and we talked, and I felt at least just an instantaneous connection, and I knew that we're going to be friends for many, many years, and I've had that feeling with only a few people, and you were one of them. And I also mentioned to them that you came to Israel and stayed with me for a while, and we had a chance to talk about all sorts of things. The very last thing, so Mariano and I, in Israel, went to the beach, and we're sitting on the beach in the sand, and it's sunset, and it's really beautiful. And Mariano asked me if I know Neruda's 20 love poems and one poem of discontent or something like that. And I told him that yeah, I had read it, but a long time ago. And then Mariano, you probably don't remember, but he said, so I'll say them to you. And he said a number of the poems where he translated them from the original Spanish into English as we were sitting in this romantic setting on the beach with the sunset. And that is Mariano. That's part of Mariano. So Mariano, thank you so much really for being here, for taking time out. And we're all very much looking forward to hearing what it is that you have to say to us. So welcome to India and to AMMACHI Labs and the Center for Women Empowerment and Gender Equality. And the last thing, the woman who runs all of this and is really inspiration behind it is Bhavani Rao, and Bhavani is
Sid, you're getting cut off.
So just as kind of introduction, Bhavani. Okay, so what I said was, I'm going to switch to my iPhone. What I said was that the head of AMMACHI Labs and the Center for Women Empowerment and Gender Equality is Bhavani Rao, and she's here among us. So Bhavani, can you say hello?
Hi, thank you so much
Hello,
for joining us.
my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Okay, so Mariano, the floor is yours. Thank you again for taking time to be with us.
Okay, so well, first, thanks, Sid, with all the warmth of my heart for this introduction. It means all. I think that's at least to me, that's the only reason I do what I do. I mean, I like the science, I like the results, but in the end, it's a way of human communication and human friendship and human bonds. I don't see a better reason to do what we do. And this is what I think it's the best of science. What just happened, at least to me. I mean, that's the reason to do what we do. And you know, I'm these days part in science, part outside science. I'm taking other paths as well. And as you were speaking, I remember why I love science. And it's not so much the publishing and investigation, which I like, of course, so much, but it's the kind of friendship that builds from this. And so I mean, I of course, and I very much want to say this. I have the same feelings of very intense and an immediate sense of friendship, and one that's very beautiful, but also very strange, because we haven't passed so much time together for the friendship we have. All in all, like it's been a few days in our lives that we have shared, but it's a very close relation. So I'm very happy to be able to share this moment again with you. Although I would very much prefer to be there, as I'm sure also you would. But at least that's what we have, and at least we are seeing each other and talking. And the kind of science I would like to present you today is precisely about that. It's about conversation. It's about what happens when people speak, and how they change their minds, and how they make different decisions in the moment they have an opportunity to share their ideas with others. And please, if I'm going to be speaking, I don't have feedback, so I will need you to let me know if at any time the communication is not good or something like that. I'll keep speaking, but please do give me feedback every now and then to be sure that I'm not speaking on the void. So before I go into my topics, two general things. The first one is I'm not going to be sharing slides, because I think that distance now is enough that at least it's better if you see my face and you see my expressions, and you do have the paper. So I didn't feel there was much need. If I do need figures, I will draw them on paper and show them on the camera, but I thought there was no need for slides. The other thing is, as I said, I'm going to be speaking about how groups talk to each other, and in the process of talking, they can refine or improve their process of thinking and their process of decision making. And the way I'm seeing this conversation is a symmetric conversation, where it's people that have no specific roles in this one conversation. But this, I think it's very important to, especially in this environment, to emphasize that it's related to many other forms of human communication. And one of them is, of course, teaching, is what, in a way, what we are doing now. Now we are having a conversation, but it's not a typical one, in the sense that I'm speaking a lot and you are hearing a lot, and I'm trying to convey you knowledge that I have that I presume that you do not have. And the reason I'm saying this is, of course, I'm sure you all know, but this needs to be said explicitly, is because there is one person that has changed, I think, completely the story of how we understand the cognitive mechanisms by which we teach, and that's precisely Sid. So I thought that things have consequences, and the science I'm gonna be telling you today, on a way, unfolds or is related to conversations that I have had with Sid many times, on the idea of how we can influence others with our thoughts, on the idea of how teaching may be a helpful process, both for the person that receives the teaching content, the learner, but also to the person that is actually teaching, because as Seneca said, docendo dicimus, teaching we learn, or by teaching we learn twice. So I'm going to come back to this, but I wanted to introduce that the ideas I'm going to be presenting today are very much in the heart and related to the idea of how humans share information, and to the willingness and to what happens when they do so, and how eventually our understanding of our environment improves by talking to other ones. So, second little bit of introduction is, we are now living peculiar days. I mean, it's not the first time in history that people live peculiar days. We have this feeling that those are extraordinary. Maybe they're not so extraordinary in history, but relative to the last 20 or 30 years, they're more agitated. And one of the things that has happened on this turbulence of all sorts, like biological turbulence, climate turbulence, social and political turbulence, is the idea of speech fragmentation. A word that we've heard a lot is the idea of polarization, is the idea that people really get confronted and they hold to their ideas extraordinarily strong, on a way that they cannot negotiate them, and on a way that they cannot talk to other people that hold different ideas. We've seen this all over the world in parallel. It has happened. It's become very prominent now in the US election between Trump and Biden. It's now where I live in Spain, for example, there's a very strong case between people that live in Catalonia and people that live outside. And in all these cases, there is a very strong segregation. The example of Catalonia, I think, is a very good one because it's not so much associated to other political variables, like being a liberal or left or right. I mean, the majority of the people that live in Catalonia are independentists. The majority of the people that do not live in Catalonia are not. And this is a very clear example that and that's something that the majority of the people do not understand. If I take any of my neighbors in Madrid, which are very vividly and strongly and wholeheartedly against independentism, and I tell them, look, if you were to have been grown in Barcelona, in Catalonia, you'll have an 85% of thinking completely different, because that's just the statistics. I mean, we're in a meeting where there's 30 people, and 24 of you today would be holding completely different views. And of course, that's something they resist very strongly, because they think that they have very good reasons to think what they think. But something which is very hard to understand is that these conclusions actually come out from very vast processes of deliberation, where one can look at different pieces of the story and build logic from that, rational logic, make conclusions which we are very confident, but which have the error, which Kahneman has pointed out so many times, which is that we feel we are sensing the entire information space, but we are only looking at some points of the evidence. So in a way, my talk today is going to be, I would like to present it as trying to bring you again the idea of hope on conversation. I think we've lost this hope. We're in a moment in which we have a huge skepticism on the capacity of conversation to solve human issues. And in a way, we've given up on this idea. And I will try to make the point, and it's going to be a point made from science, of course. It's not a political or an ideological point. I'm going to try to give you science showing that this is a wrong conclusion that comes from the fact that we are not holding conversations in their natural environment, where they should be and in the way that they should be. So I'm going to be trying to provide you evidence that when this happens, conversations can be extremely powerful in actually improving human thought. So the first example, I'm going to give you 3 examples. 2 are mine, 1 comes from another laboratory. It's from the laboratory of Hugo Mercier. He's, to my taste, a brilliant scientist doing very interesting work around these ideas, which I just told you. And Hugo has these studies in which he gives people problems which are hard on a way. They're easy, but they're hard. And I'm going to give you one of these problems. It's difficult, but I would like maybe you can answer me in the chat what you think. I'm going to read it because I would like to give you this precisely. So I'm going to read it exactly. So here's it's a problem of logic, okay? It's a problem of deduction. And you will have to make your own conclusion. And if you can give it to me, in a few 20 seconds or 15 seconds or something like that. So here's how the problem goes. I'll say it slow because it has a lot of words, and like mathematical problems, often the difficulty is not so much in the logic, but in holding the entire thing together. But that's part of the thing. So, and I'll give you what you have to do beforehand. So you have to tell me whether a statement I'm going to say is right or whether it's wrong. Or third alternative, very important, is there is not enough information to say whether this is right or wrong. Okay, so you have 3 choices. I'm going to tell you something, and you need to tell me from the logic I just gave you whether what I propose is correct, it's incorrect, or we cannot tell. Okay, that's option 3, which is very important. So here's what happens. Paul, that's the problem. Paul is looking at Linda. Paul looks at Linda, okay? And Linda looks to John. You can write this down if you want. Paul looks to Linda. Linda looks to John. Okay, that's the first part of the evidence. Paul, the first one that looks to Linda, is married. John is not married. Okay, so now I'm going to put these things together. Paul, who is married, Paul is a married person, looks to Linda. And Linda, in turn, looks to John, who is not married. Okay, I'm saying it, I'm helping you. Normally, Hugo Mercier will not give you all this help, but I want this to have a chance. So Paul is married, looks at Linda, and Linda looks at John, who is not married. And the question is a person who is married looking at a person who is not married? Is this true? Is this false? Or you cannot say? I'm gonna say it once again. It's an exercise of logic, okay? So the question is a married person looking at a not married person? This is the question. Yes, no, or I cannot say. And the data is Paul is married, looking at Linda. Linda is looking at John, and John is not married. And the question is it true? Is it not true? Or we cannot say? I see already their responses in the chat. Okay, so the vast majority already, there are many cannot says. And this is what most of the people respond in this. So as you imagine, this experiment has been done many times, and this is the response. It's wrong. It's a wrong response, but it's right. It is the right way of thinking, it's a human way of thinking, but it leads us to the wrong conclusion. And the reason the majority of you say I cannot say is because the question is a married person looking at a not married person, and we do not have this information together. We know that Paul, married person, looks at Linda, but we do not know anything about Linda. And we know that Linda, we do not know anything, is looking at John, who is not married. So we think there is not information. And that's what we respond. And once again, all of the responses here have been, I cannot say. But the point is that Linda has to be something. Either she's married or she's not married. So Paul is married, and if Linda were not to be married, then Paul is looking at Linda, who's not married, and so the response is true. Paul is married, looking at Linda, Linda's not married, so it was true. If Linda were to be married, then Linda, who is married, is looking at John, who is not married. And once again, this is true. So you can unfold the problem to yourself, but this is a typical error of logic, which holds on the idea that we do not have information, but we had information, although it was ambiguous. But this ambiguity was enough, because it was relatively short, to solve the problem, and hence the majority of us give a wrong answer. This is a classical, once again, problem in psychology. There is not anything, it's cute, but there's nothing very revealing on it, except an idea which is very well known, that we typically make these kind of mistakes that come from jumping too rapidly into conclusion. This is kind of an approximate logic, which is very effective, but which in very concrete problems, which we can try to fish them, leads to very clear mistakes. So the fact that people respond wrong in this was not Hugo Mercier's discovery. Hugo Mercier knew this. His question was, what happened if instead of, as I just did, giving this problem to each one of you, I would give this problem to a few of you, like say 3 or 4, and tell you, try to work in this problem together, in collaboration. Do speak, share your ideas, and try to find whatever happens. And what he found was 2 things. The first one was that when people got together, they had a greater chance of getting to the right conclusion. This is important. But second thing, which was more important, was that if the group had many subjects, and one had the right answer and the other ones had the wrong answer, then what happened was that the person that had the good reasons, the good arguments, could convince the other people and not the other way around. So these conversations, this is the important conclusion of Hugo Mercier, this is the first conclusion I want to share here, converged towards reason, towards rationality, and not towards irrationality. And this is because the person that has the good arguments is in a very good place to convince other people, because those arguments are typically not seen, they're not observed by people. But when they do see them, when they listen to these arguments, when they're presented on the table, once again, as a case of human teaching, here the teacher happens to be the person that knows more, then what happens is that the group converges to the right solution. So this is the first, once again, this is a paper by Hugo Mercier. I think this was not in the papers I shared with you, Sid, so I might send this paper to the group so that then you can read all the details, and of course it's much more sophisticated and interesting than what I'm just presenting. But one thing I told you I was going to tell you 3 stories, but on telling this, I want to tell you one more, and I will go on this shortly. This is a study done by Cecilia Calero. She was a postdoc in my lab, very, very, very influenced by Sid's thoughts and ideas, and she did her own work on teaching. And one study that she did with Diego de la Era, he was a grad student at the lab, which is in the heart of the study by Hugo Mercier I just told you, was the following. We worked in children, and we wanted to work in children that hold different opinions about different things. Like I just told you, an idea of polarization. Of course, with children, we do not work with ideological or political or moral polarization, but children hold strong views on many things. And one interesting one is how they change their conceptual organization about their environment, about the world in which they live, because they learn things and they go through very interesting conceptual revolutions, very interesting conceptual transitions in which they understand things in one way, and from there on they have to understand that things are different. And one classic example for this is precisely the structure of the earth. So children grow with the very natural idea that the earth is flat, because that's what all their senses tells them that's exactly how it is. And then suddenly they're given a very weird piece of information that by their parents or friends or siblings or in school, one day they are told that the earth is round. And they're even given, you know, a balloon with drawings on it, blue and brown, and they're told that these are the continents. And suddenly they have to match this idea. And this is very interesting, I think, because it's a very good example that we should take on our own of what do we do when we struggle with conflict of ideas that somehow are very different to the beliefs that we had for so many times. This has happened to all of us in our own history of development. So Stella Bosniadou, she's a researcher in Greece. She has done brilliant work understanding how this transition happened. And it's very interesting, it doesn't happen in one day. It's not like children, one day they understand this. It takes them like a year or a year and a half or 2 years or months to actually completely understand all the things that need to be entangled on the idea that if the earth is round, then why do we not fall? Why things seems to be always on top of us? Why is the sky always in top and not in the bottom? And why, I mean, all these things need to be reconciled. And children go through very different understandings of how this can be solved. Like the very first idea is that the earth is round, but it's a flat, it's a disk, it's not a sphere. A second idea is that the earth is round, but it's hollow. So it's like we live in a bowl, and that's why we do not fall. And Stella has understood and learned this because she asks children when they say the world is round, she goes, okay, perfectly, just draw it for me. And when they actually make these drawings, she understands that actually it's round, not in the sense that we understand the roundness of the earth, but in a very different conception. So what Cecilia and Diego did is that they put children together, once again, and they were in the same class, that had very different understandings of the structure of the earth. And once again, those are natural fluctuations, variability in cognitive development. I mean, some children understand this more rapidly, either because they were told this before or because they have better intuitions on this or whatever reason. But you have a group of children in a class which hold very different views, not political views, but views about how something very important is. And we make them talk to each other. And the way we make them talk to each other is we ask them to actually make this drawing, once again, in collaboration. So it's not a typical example of teaching in the classical sense of Sid studies, in the sense that there's one person that holds the title of the teacher and one person that holds the title of the student. It's a conversation. And so important is that one child, I mean, you can imagine that there's a space of knowledge and correctness given by physical reality, and children, they progress on this axis. Like they go from a model which is completely wrong, which is the earth is flat, until they understand in the very end, like a whole cosmological understanding of the earth is round, it floats in space, there's a sun, it turns around the sun, it also turns around itself, we do not fall because there's gravity, and that's the richest understanding that they can have. After that, of course, some of them come back to be part of flat earth societies, as there are now many people that now are completely convinced that the earth is flat and that the idea of roundness is a complete illusion, but this we will forget for a second. So you can imagine that there is a way of of moving in the progression and the understanding of an idea on an axis. And what we do is we get together children that are in different places in this axis. There's one child that knows, has very correct and substantial and grounded knowledge. And there's a child that's more naive or that holds wrong ideas or wrong models about this conception. And we put them together. And the question is what happens? And you can imagine different things, like they could both agree to the middle. And so it could be that the child that knows less improves, but this is at the cost of a child that's actually agreeing on a wrong idea, so loses some of his or her knowledge. You can also imagine that actually kind of a delusionary idea. So the child that has the wrong arguments because they are more attractive or seductive, this could be possible. It's the kind of the idea of why fake news are so vivid. It's because they're fiction. And fiction typically is more attractive than reality. So it could be that on average, actually that child that knows less moves to the other side. Or it could be that it goes to the side of things that are unrelated to knowledge, like they're more related to temperament, or to character, or to social dominance, and whoever pulls. Now, the data, and I'll show you again, this paper is completely at odds with this idea, and it shows that very, very consistently, once again, like in the study of Mercier, like in this study, and the studies I'm gonna show you after this, dialogue converges to reason, to rationality. So what happens is that typically the child that knows the most, and once again, he's not been given a title of teacher, assumes this role. And the child that knows the less progresses in the direction of knowledge without this having a cost for the child that's more experienced or more versed in this particular direction. So this is a very seductive idea also in practical terms on things that also Sid is very involved and has been one of the leading persons on this, which is the idea of peer tutoring, and eventually the idea of transitioning to some aspects of education that may not be done by a magistral class of a big lecture that like we are doing now, but that comes more on peer work in which like both students will be solving solutions for each other. So this is second study. So first study, Mercier, the one you experienced on logical deduction. Group conversation helps there. By the way, there's a movie which I recommend if you like. It's called 12 Angry Men. I think that's Sid, you say yes, so it might be, I'm not sure this is the title. So the way this movie works is that it's a jury. It's a classic Hollywood movie, and it's a brilliant one. Today, it would not be called 12 Angry Men. It would be called 12 Angry Persons, and that's how it should be. And the jury should be men and women. But in these times, I mean, that was not even a consideration. So of course, rational deliberation was a male exercise, and so they're men, all of them. And they're a jury. And the movie begins with a teenager that's being condemned to the assassination of his father. And the jury moves to deliberation, to the deliberation room, and they go, it's because the arguments are very clear that he's guilty, so they go, okay, let's sign this very fast, he's guilty, let's vote, and they vote, yes, he's guilty, all of them, except one. And one says, I think he's not guilty. Or not, he says better, I think we do not have sufficient evidence. He might be, but we do not have sufficient evidence to say he's guilty. And so this is a little bit like the Mercier experiment. It's one person that holds rational reasons against an idea which is very obvious and intuitive, and it's very fast and kind of easy to do, which is let's sign, this is fast. And he tries to convince all of the other people and change their minds, all the other people. So this is a Hollywood version of the Mercier experiment, which I do recommend to you, because I think it's the whole process of argumentation of the elements of what it takes to be in a minority, but to be in the power of reason, and use these to change the minds of a whole group with the power of reason. I think it's a very good visual demonstration in fiction, of course, but then you can read the papers and at the same time see the movie, and I think that with these things they may be in a way a little bit synergic. So now to in a few minutes to our two studies. Those two studies were led by a remarkably brilliant postdoc in my lab and at UCL, University College of London. Now he's faculty and he's the director of the lab where I used to be the director in Buenos Aires. He's Joaquin Navajas. And with him, we've been doing a lot of studies of how groups make decisions, which is in the heart of what we are saying now. And the first of these studies was on, we wanted to measure the quality of decisions by groups of people on decisions that are not like the Mercier decision where there's like a right or wrong answer. They're not logic, but they're more like the majority of decisions which we make, which are kind of approximate. You can imagine like decisions like the place where you send your children to school. This is a very important decision, but it's not like a decision that can be either right or wrong. You get an estimate of what other possibilities could have been. And this is true also for like all social decisions, the people we are with, our health decisions, our living decisions, the people we vote. In the majority of these decisions, we have only partial information and we cannot judge exactly we can have an estimate of the quality of the decision, but they live more on the dark. So always in science, you need a model for this. And the model of this that has been used in studies prior to the ones we did is things which are called of approximate knowledge. So the kind of questions would be, and we can do that actually, we can do that on the chat. Like if I were to ask you what is the height of the Eiffel Tower, and you cannot read this on the internet, what do you think that would be? Do respond me on the chat. What is the height of the Eiffel Tower? Someone has to be brave and be the first. I mean, that's, you know, it's not 300 miles and you know, it's not 2 millimeters. You know, it's somewhere between.
Your question, please.
Much taller than me, said someone. That's 100 meters, 300 meters, 120. Okay, that's perfect. Okay. You know what? I don't even have the right answer. So someone can Google it for me. And then write what we will call the ground truth, which is Google's understanding of this. I think it depends also on if you consider the antenna or not. But you see, this is a problem of estimation because you get an idea of what a typical building is. So like for instance, say a 20-story building is 60 meters because we may say 3 meters per floor. And the Eiffel Tower was the larger building in the time. So it must be like 50 or 60 or 80 stories. Maybe it's not as much as the Empire State Building. And so you can see how 324 to the tip. So somewhere very, very, very clear. There was also an 800. And so if this is the kind of problem in which people have relatively good estimates, but they also have a lot of noise. And also, typically, the reason why these problems are interesting is that often you're not aware of the reasoning by which you are coming to the conclusions that you come. So when people say 200 meters, they've done some thinking in their minds, but they're not aware of what thinking has come. They are doing calculations of this sort, of what's the typical size of a building, what's the size of a person, how many persons, how many times would I fit? I mean, there are different ways of trying to solve this problem. And so the result we found with Joaquin, I'm going to go, once again, you have the paper, so you can do the reading, and I'm going to go to the essence of the results verbally here, and then we can, of course, you can ask me any questions and we can go. By the way, you can stop me at any time. I didn't mention this. This is Zoom, but do feel you can unmute yourself and ask questions. Actually, I would be very happy if you do that. So I don't speak in continuous flow. So please do ask questions if you do not feel at all inhibited by that, by the Zoomness of this meeting. And so the result we found with Joaquin was that this is what we did. We asked people to judge, as I just did. Then we got people together. And so they got in groups of 3 or 5. And then they conversated. And the conversation was completely open. And the conversation could go in any direction. And after that, they converged together. They agreed on a result that was the result of the group. And then after doing that, they could go back and they could change their minds and say, you know what, after the conversation I have had, I want to change my view and I want to have a different result. So here's the results of what we found. The first thing is, number one, very important. All of them are to me relevant. The ones I'm gonna tell you now. It's a summary of the things that I think are important. So the first one is groups are much better than individuals. And once again, we have a ground truth for these problems. And so when we compare the proximity, the numerical proximity of the solutions of the groups compared to the solutions of individuals, they're much better. So this is the first point. Just speaking to other people improves the quality of the decision. Second point, again, important to me. This is not just a matter of averaging. So the responses of the group are much better than if you take the responses of the individuals and you average them and you compare this average to what the group had. So the group is doing something more. The first intuition of the group is just democracy. It's averaging. Like I say 100, you say 200, 150. And groups could do that. But empirical results is groups do something which is much better than that. Because the result they converge to is much better than the average. Result number 3. It's not only much better than the average, but it's much better than any mathematical operation you can build on the results of the groups. So let me now explain clearly what I mean by this. Imagine I said 100, Sid said 150, and Babani said 200. So we can do different things with these numbers. We can do an average, but we can do, for instance, also a median. We can take the one in the middle. Or we can forget extremes and take the one in the middle. Or because we have information also, people also responded, or their confidence on how much they thought their response was correct, we could take only the opinion of the expert, the one that declares to know more. Or we could take the opinion of everyone, but weighted by how much they know. So the one that knows more has more weight in the average than the other people. Or we could take an average, but we could filter out outliers. This is statistically very reasonable. So if there's a 100 and 120 and 150 and a 3 million, we can say the 3 million we do not average, but we average the other ones. We just, like we do in science, we take away the outliers. We don't like. So there's a mathematical way of asking what's the most. We did not record what groups were talking, so we did not have these conversations. We are doing another experiment now to do that, but we could infer what they were doing by their responses. And what we found is that the most proximal thing is one that uses confidence weighted average, so it's average weighted by knowledge. It uses other things like trimming outliers, but even then, groups are doing something better. And so the question is, what's happening? And what happens, and this is also very clear just from recollections of what groups say they have done, is that they are not working with their responses, with their conclusions, but they're working with the process by which they reach their responses. So it's not like I said, it's 100 for me, it's 120 for you, and now let's negotiate where we agree. But we begin asking the question of why did I say 100? And why did you say 120? And in the moment we do that, this is the critical thing. All these elements of the decision process, which are unconscious, they are implicit, they are unaware, they become aware. And this is what I like to think as one of the essential ideas when Sid conveys the benefit of teaching for the teacher. It is that it's an exercise of metacognition. You reflect on your thought process, and this is also, by the way, an idea that Feynman, for instance, the great physical teacher, he said, when you want to learn something, first you try, then you try again, and once you think you know it, you teach it. And the reason he said that is because in the moment you do that, you realize it's a huge error correction mechanism. It's a way of monitoring your own process of thought and understanding why you may be making some errors. So once again, the empirical result is groups are better than individuals. Conversation, once again, concludes to more rational decisions and to decisions that are better in quality and better in quantity. But this happens because there's a revision of the process of thought in the moment of conversation. And once again, this happens because these conversations are between groups of 3. If we were to put, and we have done these experiments, groups of 25 instead of groups of 3, then groups converge to something very different, because 25 people cannot share their ideas. What happens is that someone stands stronger than the other ones and convinces all the other people. And so what happens when you have 25 people instead of 3, that's not the natural habitat, natural environment for conversations, is what we see these days with politics and with polarization and with echo chambers, which is that there's a person that somehow convinces all of the other ones, and the other ones somehow become followers and herds of this particular person. This does not happen when conversations occur in their natural environment. So this is the first of our 2 studies. And the last one I want to show, and then we
May I ask a quick question? Sorry.
Yes, thank you.
Are you saying optimal group is 3?
No, we do not know. We do not know the optimal. That's a good question. We know the extremes. We know 1 is bad, and we know 30 is bad. In between, it's good, and we know we've done 3 and 5, and it's hard to say which one. So there will be kind of an inverted U shape, and we have not done this careful experiment. It's a very difficult one because you have to have many groups of different sizes, and those experiments are very hard to do. But it is probably close to 3 or close to 5. There is a famous example on a literature I have found to be quite interesting, which is the literature of management in general. I mean, because management is a huge practical problem where people have to find practical and good decisions for all sorts of problems. And they've done a lot of very interesting research which does not mix so much with academic research on cognitive psychology. So there's an expression there which is fear on the board, fire on the corridor. And so the way this works, which apparently is typical of all boards, is that there's a board of a company, or you could think the board of a university, and someone is presenting something. And this can be typical of any conference. You will recognize, I think, what I'm presenting now. And so people are thinking like, this is wrong, this is completely wrong. There's like, that cannot be, they should not do that. There's silence. That's the fear on the board. And then they go to the corridor and you get with your friend and you tell him, that's completely wrong. I mean, why were they doing this? And why? That's the fire on the corridor. And the question is why this fire was not ignited where it should, which was in the board. That's the reason a board is made. You present things and someone tells you this is completely wrong. And the reason this is not done is because boards are too large. That's a table of 15 people. Typically, the majority of people feel inhibit. There's not sufficient time. There's not sufficient freedom. There's not sufficient commodity. So once again, we don't know exactly the numbers, but I would say that the groups that are typically made for error correction in practical cases are often too large. And this is why in the experience they do not work. And they need to be made smaller. A second idea, which is not the size, but is the variability of the group, is that there's a lot of, we have some results of that, and other people, Hugo Mercier also has a lot of results on that, and Bajador Barami has some results on that, is that groups are better when they're more diverse. And again, the reason is very intuitive, is that you need someone that will not confirm your thoughts, but that will question your thoughts. On peer tutoring, it is known that and Sid may correct this and provide more information on that, that the benefits of the teacher are greater when the student actually is a good student, asking the challenging questions, because this is what probes the teacher to question his or her own models of reasoning and or models of thought. If you have a student that agrees to all what you say, then essentially you've dampened the exercise of teaching. It's not there's not much need of reflection from the side of the teacher. So once again, groups are better when they allow everybody to speak, and this is a matter of size, but it's also a matter of social comfort and other topological social considerations. And they're also much more efficient when they are variable. This is known. Sid and I, we both like football. And it's very known in football that you have to have teams that are diverse. You put the best 10 forwards in a team, and it's the 10 stars of the moment, but they don't work. You need to have, a diversity of styles, diversity of approximations, and this on a group tends to converge to much better things. So the way it's presented so far is I began with the example of Mercier, which is how groups of people talk and think about logic. This is the most exact case. Then I went to situations which do not pertain to the domain of logic, but they remain situations in which there is a ground truth. So in a way, they're easy because you can compare good and bad decisions. But now I would like to go in the last example to what I think is the most challenging and the most difficult space, which are those decisions which are in a way the axioms of our thinking, those decisions that are hard to be called wrong or right. They're our beliefs. They're the things which we think is that's how we should act. It's morality, it's ideology. Of course, there is reason and there's logic. People, when they come to these big conclusions, I mean, if I conclude that there should not be slaves in society, which is to me an important moral of society, I do have arguments for that, and I do have a logic for that. It's not, but this logic in the end is axiomatic. I do go in the very end to the idea that no human should owe the rights of other human, and this is something that's in a way it's on my heart. And so the question is, what happens when, and this comes to what I think is very pressing in terms of political reality these days, which is when we try to make people speak about these things that they clearly seem not to be able to speak. So things in which they are really confronted. So what if I get someone that really thinks that Trump is the savior of the American soul, with someone that thinks that he has been the person that actually he has put the United States democracy in a risk that it had never been exposed to? And once again, the way I would like to think this is not between smart and idiots, or between people that are obviously holding the right arguments and people holding the wrong arguments. The way I think it's interesting to think about this discussion is agnostically, by thinking that in their own space of thought, this is not, I'm not arguing for relativism and for saying that it's all the same, but I'm saying that in the conclusions that they make often do come also from a rational thinking that is restricted to another space of ideas and another space of priorities. So an example which I think we can think is a better one is the example of independentism in Catalonia and in Spain. This is the tension between two licit arguments. One is the argument of the value of a constitution. Spain is a country, and the constitution says that you have freedom in a country, but not the freedom to do whatever you want to do. You cannot kill another person, you cannot cross red lights on a traffic, and this is part of a social pact. And part of a social pact is we are a team, and this team has obligations to each other, and these obligations constitute the nation, and it's not the right of any village or any town or any region to actually, in the moment of their willingness, declare that they want to be themselves. That's not, if they want to do that, then the constitution has to be changed, but it's a process that requires very substantial and frictionated political instance. Now, there's other people thinking that, you know, it's the will of the people. And if here, you know, and historically, we feel that we've never been part of that. We are part of this monarchy. Spain is a monarchy because there was a war that happened many years ago, and we lost this war, and we were annexed, and we've never been. And in a way, we've always struggled, but always in domination. And now it's come the time in which we want to be free and independent. And so each of these ones have their own merits, and they have, of course, different epics, as always. I mean, one of the stories has the advantage of being more epical or more emotional also. But it happens to be that there is a very strong geographical distribution of what seems to be more important, which is just, once again, an issue of priorities between axioms that probably everyone has, both of them, but their strength and their volume in the constitution of our morality, it changes according, you know, to our sensitivities, to the beliefs of our friends, to what the songs that we like that speak about certain things, to the stories of law. I mean, many things that actually give a personal idiosyncrasy on this particular opinion. So we wanted to build an experiment about this. And to build the experiment, we first need to find the cases. And we worked with all sorts of cases. Some were very theoretical and not very uncomfortable. So for instance, things like, what would you do if an artificial intelligence suddenly seems to have had consciousness? It's one of ideology. Imagine you work in a program, and the program, you have to reboot it every day, and one day you want to reboot it, but the program says, I don't want to be rebooted. I like my life and like my feelings, and if you reboot me, then it will be someone else, but not me. And why should you kill me? I like my, and so the question is, what should you do? And this is, of course, a definition of life and a definition, and it holds on very different views. And people have different opinions on this and so on. And some people think very strongly that if something is an entity that declares and in all ways seems to be alive, then it should be treated as such. And others think we humans have very special values, and this is a computer, and so they think very differently. And so people discuss. But this discussion is not so surprising because it's not very, as I said, very uncomfortable. It's not the kind of discussion where people will feel very reactive to the opinions of the other. They may disagree, they may even disagree strongly, but they will not build passion around other ones that were much more passionate. For instance, Argentina was undergoing through all these years, now it's become a law of liberty of abortion, which in most of South America is illegal. In Argentina, it has changed now, but of course it has its boundaries. So you cannot do it at any time, like you have to do it at 4 months and so on. And so we looked at like the parameters so that people were really split. And in the case of abortion, this can be very simply done by just changing the month of abortion. So the majority of the people agree that abortion at 1 day is right, although some people do not. The majority of the people think that abortion 1 day before conception, without any significant medical reason, maybe is not so right. And so we understand there that there's a gradient, and that there are considerations, and that there are elements, and so becomes a practical opinion, whether at 2 months or 3 months. And people think very differently about this, and this is a discussion that becomes very heated politically, with street battles, and so this is the kind of discussion. Or again, I'm saying things that may sound uncomfortable. I hope I do not, but this is science. So we ask questions like, for instance, a dilemma we had, which we asked to our groups, was, which I think it's interesting in itself, is this is the case of 2 adults. They're siblings. We do not even know their gender. Doesn't matter. And they like each other very much. And they're responsible. They're adults. They understand everything, and they want to have sex between themselves. They just want, I mean, it's their freedom, and they feel, so they do it. And the question is if this is right or wrong. And I once again, I have my own opinion on each of these things, that it's completely irrelevant in this conversation. What I think about these things. What's relevant is that people about these things think very heartedly different. So some people think it's completely wrong. It's disgusting, it's wrong, it should not be done. And some people think, I mean, they're adults, they're free. Who cares? I mean, they do what they want to do. And we, in the argument, there was also the idea that there was no conception, so there cannot be the idea that they're maybe do something that has consequences on a future life. I mean, it was just for the pleasure of doing it. And so once again, this is a kind of conversation where people beforehand, they think very strongly, and they think they will never change their minds. So if you ask them about these questions, like, what is your thought? They will give you a thought, and you ask them, like, what is the rigidity of your thought? What do you think is the likelihood that if you speak to someone different than you, they may change your mind? And people think that that's not going to happen, because this is the kind of things that I'm very attached to. And so what we did is we asked people to conversate about this. And we asked them to conversate on a situation. Once again, we're trying to build these natural environments for conversation. So we told them, imagine you're part of an ethical committee, and you have the responsibility of coming with a decision. And the decision will only come if there is absolute consensus within the group of a degree of rightness or wrongness about these things. So imagine the case of siblings, you may say, 1 is completely wrong, it should be completely forbidden. 10 is completely right, there's nothing wrong on that. Or you can say 8, which is, it's completely right, but you know, there's consideration that may be wrong, and you're not the judges. You do not have to respond like this is allowed or not allowed. You're passing this to a Senate, to a Congress, that will hear your opinion on the wrongness of that. But will hear your opinion only if there's consensus. If you do not agree, all of you, if there's a single person of you that does not want to sign this number, then what will be passed to the Senate is that there was not consensus on this particular topic. This particular topic, the group could not come. So the group here does not have a specific commitment compared to the first experiment where they had to give a number. They could not do it if they do not want to. But here, they're explicitly asked that they only have to give a number if they feel that they are all comfortable with giving these numbers. And so our question here, the main question, the most important question, was when they reach consensus and when they do not. It's not so much what consensus they reach, which is also interesting, but it's secondary in importance to me. But here, which is kind of the question of the first study, I mean, when you think that and you think that, where do we agree? Here, there's a first order question, which is, are people willing to agree or not? And so the first curve, which you'll see in the paper I shared with you, and it's quite obvious, is that if you take people that of course, the groups were stochastic. So we put people together, and often we put 3 people that agreed, so that the initial difference of opinion was very low, and so the agreement was very high. So what I'm going to show here is in this axis, there's going to be the initial difference in opinions, and in this axis, the agreement. If the difference in opinion is very low, the agreement is very high. And as the difference of initial differences of opinions increases, the probability that they will agree goes down. This is normal. But the question is, where does it go down to? And our result in different experiments is that even in complete disagreement, like if I put a person that had a 1 and a person that had a 10 in the same group, the likelihood that they will end up agreeing to something in between, maybe an 8, maybe a 6, maybe a 4, maybe a 5, they will agree to something in between, was between 25 and 50%, so close to 35%, depending on the group, depending on the study. We've done this in different countries, in different places, with different questions. But it varies, but typically it's very far from 0, and it's closer to 50% than it is to 0. And importantly, it's much, much greater than the intuitions that people have about the probability of disagreement. So if we make a mental experiment where we ask people, what do you think would happen if I put these 2 people together to think about that? What do you think the probability of agreement would be? Then people respond like 2%, 1%, 0%, 3%. Empirical result, and that goes to what I said in the very beginning, is we've become skeptic about our capacity of fixing things with words. And experimental results, all the ones I've given you today and many others, show that in the right conditions, people are much more reasonable than what we think they are. And the last piece of evidence, and with this I'll close, is we could, so in the groups in which there was a 1 and a 10, there was another, so groups here were groups of 3. So there was a 1 and a 10 and someone else. And so someone that completely disagreed, someone that completely agreed, and a third person that varied across the different groups. And so, well, as I said, about 40 or 35% of these groups reach agreement. We could ask why some of them reach agreement and some of them did not. And importantly, one question, so you guys, like, does it depend on age? Does that depend on the regressors that you want to ask? To us, the most interesting one was, what's the role of the third person? Because there you can have very different mental models. One possibility is, well, groups will reach an agreement when the third person is also very aligned with one of the other ones. So if you have a 2 against 1, and result was that that didn't happen. Like groups that were like that, it's not by the force of majority that you convince the third person. It's not like you bring that person more arguments and you say, yeah, I'm right and I'm also right, and the person will be stubborn and will be received on their particular position. The groups that reached consensus were the ones that had someone close to the middle. And this particular person, if you take, as we always measure confidence in people's opinions. And so confidence works, as you would imagine, naturally, that people that are in the extremes are also much more confident. So if I think it's completely right, I tend to be very confident. If I think that something's completely wrong, I'm at 0, then I'm also very confident. And people in the middle, the grays, they tend to doubt more. They're more unconfident. But there's a substantial amount of people in the middle that are what we call the high confident grays. Those people that are in the middle of an opinion, but that they are so because they understand that there are arguments in favor and arguments against, and they're very convinced that the right position is to adhere to both of them. So the groups that typically converge to a consensus in the difficult situation of a lot of friction of two very opposed people were the ones in the third person was kind of in the center, strongly was convinced that that was the right place to be. And with this, I told you that was the last experiment I was going to show, but I want to close with very rapidly with an experiment we are doing. Now, if you take this to the space of argumentation, and imagine the following thing. Imagine like one important case, practical. Like, for instance, now there's COVID vaccination. I don't know how it's in India, but in Europe, like there was a huge desperation to get the vaccine. Now we have people that do not want to be given the vaccine, and that they're very strongly, and they have all sorts of conspiracy theories of, you know, Bill Gates being the owner of the vaccine and the virus and the blood and he. And so this is a difficult practical social situation. There's a very significant crowd in France, so to say. France has the largest one of them, of people that are radical militants against the idea of vaccination in general, not just COVID vaccination. It's the best thing you could do. And of course, in science, you have to simplify this. So the way we do this is we take people that are very convinced about something, and we are asking what is the right way to change their minds. And we are testing two different, we do not have the results of this. This is an experiment we are doing, but we have hypotheses. One possibility is I'll give you 3 very good arguments against what you think. I'm going to tell you that vaccines are safe. I'm going to show you the data of other previous diseases and the history, and I'm going to try to show you that you're wrong and that you're thinking the problem, and like I'm going to hit you hard on this. The other possibility is I'm going to give you the same number of arguments, but some of them are going to be against your views, and some of them are going to be in favor of your views. I'm going to show you what I'm trying to say with this is, and that you're not stupid, that actually it's that maybe you should understand that the space of argumentation is larger and that the considerations that you have are controllable, but there are others. Maybe on watching these others, and our hypothesis is that given, so we are doing this experiment where we give people 4 arguments, and one treatment is 4 arguments are 4 arguments in favor of the view they do not hold. So I'm trying to convince you in the usual way, like I'll tell you this, you're wrong because of A, B, C, and D. In the other case, I'll tell you, you know, you're right about A and B, and you're right to worry about it, but there's also C and D. And so the question is, which is more effective? And our hypothesis is that the second one, which is not the typical one, that's not how people that they approach the problem. It's not in the understanding that this other tribe, which we see as irrational, may have rational arguments that are attainable, maybe not maybe they should not be the priority, but can be here. And so once again, this is an ongoing experiment, but I thought it could be interesting also to end up with, not with a conclusion, with an idea. So with this, I think it's definitely time to finish. Sorry, I think I've taken more time than I should. And I'm glad to take any questions that you may have.
To be the master of ceremonies and the Kuala people. So some people think in words, other people think in sentences, still others in paragraphs, some in articles, some in chapters, others in books. Mariano is the book type. And all of this that we heard now, without notes, without the crutch of PowerPoint. Mariano, thank you really very much. A quick comment about abortion. My guess is that people around abortions, and part of it has to do with when you think that life begins. And if you think that life begins at the moment of inception when the sperm enters the ovum, like Catholics do, and then you have genetic material for a unique individual, a unique person, life begins then. And some people, like some Protestants, believe that life begins when the fetus is capable of living outside of the mother's life support system, outside of the womb. And those are some Protestants. The Jewish people believe that life begins when the last kid leaves the house. So Mariano, again, thank you very much. Really great fun, and happy that I made you laugh. And so Melton, Nandita, can you take over? Mariano, also later on today, sometime in the near future, I'd like to, but not here, but other matters.
You'd like to? I lost the connection when you said that.
I'd like to meet with you, talk to you afterwards, not now, but sometime in the next couple of days.
Me too.
Okay.
We'll do so.
So, Melton, are you here?
Or questions,
No.
if people feel more comfortable, you can ask questions in the chat also. That's fine also.
Okay.
I can read them, and maybe that's easier than intervening. So if you prefer to, or we can have no questions. But if you do have questions or comments in the chat, I can read it, and that maybe also.
Well, I see Bhavani wrote, I have questions, but don't know how to do the hand raise. So Bhavani.
I did. I figured it out. Sorry, it was a little lost. Thank you so much. That was a super fascinating talk, and it's so we're doing. I don't know. I think Sid sent you a little bit about the kind of work that we do. So we do a lot of work in rural areas, and there's a lot of participatory work that we do. So we work with women in groups and in communities. Almost everything that we do is in terms of getting groups to work together. So in that sense, what you spoke about is so relevant. And at this moment of time, we're running workshops with paramilitary forces and trying to get them to be more gender sensitive. So it's a question of listening to women or what their needs at home would be. And everything that you said is super relevant to everything that we're doing. So thank you so much. And it just also throws like a million questions into the air. And of course, we can ask all those questions later. But also just a couple of reflections and a few thoughts that would follow those reflections. Did you know that in Africa, the way they used to govern themselves was based on 100% consensus? So it was not a democratic thing that is 50% agree to something and then that was passed. It was never like that. And that's possible. And I don't know this, that they have to have a very strong consensus before they actually do something. But in Africa, if it's just a tribe, so the tribe chief would basically have to get the permission and okay of every single member of that community before something is actually decided on. And sometimes the decision can be postponed for years till everybody comes to a consensus, everybody agrees to something. And I was wondering if you've done studies in Africa, if those traditions still exist, it would be very interesting to know how they function, because they're not individualistic cultures. Maybe that plays some kind of a role in it. And I was wondering if there is a difference between culturally, this kind of cultures, two cultures, the Western culture, which is a little bit more individualistic, and the Eastern cultures, which are a little bit more collectivistic. So that was one thought that came to my mind. But and then there are a few thoughts that are a little bit of a stretch. Maybe I'm jumping to conclusions based on what your talk was about. But So families which are nuclear families, which just has like the mother and the father, who are the key decision makers, are probably weaker units because they have only two adults in a decision making, and maybe joint families that would have the husband and wife, maybe the grandparents also involved, were probably a strong cohesive group, and probably more prone to making right decisions because they were a slightly larger group. Because you say that the typical group is around 3 or 5 people to come to some kind of a consensus and agreement. I was just, these are just thoughts that are shooting off based on what you said. So does it then make it an argument to have families that are larger than two decision makers? Nobody's going to take the decisions of children, right? Adults are not going to think about children as decision makers. Third comment, and again reflection, again based on something that you said, we're so obsessed with the rights of artificial intelligence and unborn children, but we never take into account whether a plant wants to live or die when we decide to eat it for food. We just never machine that decides that it wants to live or die there's an ethical side to that point. But we don't necessarily ask a plant, is it okay for me to kill you, to eat you? It was just it just made me think of it. That was just a comment. The ethics of it is very interesting. And I have questions on how we could then structure villages coming to consensus. How do we work with those dynamics? But those are more complicated questions based on the kind of work that we do in villages, and especially when there is no right or wrong. But how do you give the information? How do you get these groups to effectively talk to each other? I don't know if that is a part of how you research things. Is it just that you figure out that this happens, but do you also have tactics and toolkits that we could just adapt in our work in the villages?
Yeah, so thanks. Those are all very relevant ideas and very interesting ones. It's many. I'll say just two brief things, because I think if not, maybe like just it's a lot of and consensus, and all countries have these mechanisms too. Like one case which I gave in the example of the movie is juries in the majority of the countries. So justice works on a very different way than the executive or the legislative systems, and they do so based on, and not only that, but they also work because if you think the constitution of juries in the US, they are not experts. They're just random people which are chosen on duty, and they are asked to listen a problem, and they are believed to be rational, and that's the other key thing is representative. And so there's some people that have thought, what if we would also manage our legislative system in this way? Imagine you have to run a legislation like, I don't know, imagine there's products in agriculture that you want to change because you think that's not building a good way of dealing with the land and with the health, but at the same time there's economical pressure, and you have typical situation that the government has to deal. And so typically this will be passed as a law, and there will be people that you vote that are professional politicians. And so there are many experiments that on something called deliberate democracy, which is the idea, what if the way you solve these problems to have at the same time the idea of representativeness, but also the idea of people that can think rationally and not in a heated political situation. And so examples have been made, and people do interesting in politics experiments, and they do a very good job in measuring them. It's very hard to measure the success of these things. And way of measuring the success of these things is by retrospective agreement with what you did. So you can ask 5 years later, and you can say, well, the decisions that we have come with are the ones we like and the ones we, and some experiments have shown that this way of deliberation may be more effective than the ones we have. And it's interesting because all those things were in the very beginning of this, and even mathematicians, people like Lagrange or Laplace, they thought very much on the idea of what is the best way of voting, what is the best way of actually conveying information so that whatever the majority really thinks will be taken as action. And of course, we converge to a system which we've seen now also how unstable it is. Like we choose a president that's chosen, you know, by a good number of layers of, and so I think that there is a lot of relevant research now between the cognitive science of decision making and between the political science to try to think what is, and that comes back to your last argument, what are the best express their thoughts in a way that when you put them together, you get a higher chance of converging to something that the majority will agree. And this is an empirical question for which we, you know, find very kind of brute solutions, but of course there is a lot of need on that. Second idea, and last, we also do some experiments on rural areas in the north of Argentina. And I'm saying this because it may be of interest to you. And one case we study is a case of, there's a disease which is very prominent in South America, which is dengue fever. I don't know what's the prominence of it in India. In South America, it's very, very, very endemic. It's very strong.
In India also.
In India too. Okay, and it's a kind of disease that it's a mosquito transmitted disease, and like all mosquito transmitted diseases, actions, and typically those include not being in environments where you promote the development of mosquitoes. Essentially, this means cleaning the waters. So if you have like containers with water in open spaces, this will build a lot of mosquitoes, and this ends up, I mean, epidemiological results show that with these actions you can decrease dramatically the effect of the disease. And so there's a lot of public effort of teaching. People go to these villages and they explain what I just explained, and they give the graphs, and they and those are not very effective. They are moderately effective. It's much better than nothing. But once again, this has not been very much tuned. And based on once again on this is a derivation of seed planted on Latin America of the relevance of teaching for building cognition. I'm sure I didn't pronounce this correctly. Like seed in seed and seed like Sydney do probably have like a different I. You correct me the pronunciation for this, which probably was wrong. So what we did is, what if, as this is typically done, this is done in schools, and so in schools there's someone that comes and like gives a lecture to children on how to have good measures, washing their hands, and a number of things, and then you can measure the success of that. And what we said is, what if you empower children by telling, you know, this is very important, you have to propagate the voice. And so what you have to do is you have to go to your home and explain this to your parents. They don't know that. You're the owner of knowledge now. You're 80 years old, but you know something very important, and you have to teach this to your parents. And we measure this. And the result is that when you do that, there is a very substantial improve in the effect, but most important in the duration of the effect. What happens is that this typically vanishes very rapidly. So after 2 weeks, it came back to square one. In which not only I heard this, but I had a task. I had to convey this knowledge. I had to incorporate this knowledge. I had to somehow internalize this knowledge on the process of not learning it, but teaching it to someone which is meaningful to me, to my parents. We reversed the role and all of that. We found that actually this was, once again, it's not like a game changer that now suddenly things are solved, but it's a significant and important improvement for free. On something where actually public programs have been quite unsuccessful. So we can share this paper with you too. I think I'm not sure it's published or in the process of being published, but I'll send the manuscript to Sid so that you can take a look and see whether you find this interesting. This is done by a postdoc called Julia Armida, who was also a student in the School of Education where we met with Sid. Okay, so I wanted to move to, let me see. Sid, should I do this? Should I go to the chat and respond questions there, or is that okay?
I think, I'm sorry, I think Gayatri had a question. She's got her hand up.
Okay.
Yeah, I put it in the chat, but my question is really, when we are having these group conversations, how do you typically select problems, for triggering these conversations or the base of the conversation? Sometimes, if a problem is, very personal and something that is I'm passionate about, there may be more, views. And in that case, you might have different results on how people change or people don't change, rather than when you give more intellectual problems, have that much passion behind it.
Yeah.
So do you actually, try to give problems of various kinds to see
Yeah.
whether there is an effect of this?
Yeah, so that's what we did. Then the space of problems is difficult to parameterize, to understand it. So this was to us an important question. First response is that we found the agreement was greater than people thought in all problems. But as you mentioned, and as you're thinking correctly, this is variable. There are some problems where it's easier to agree. And I think you also have the right intuition that this is related to the passion by which we confront this particular problem. We did not have this measure, so in this experiment we could not use this as a regressor. Retrospectively, it would have been great to have it, like to understand for each person. We had confidence of your opinion, which on a way has to do with how much you hold strongly to that. And this, of course, was a very important predictor of your willingness to move your opinion or not. So people, when they are very certain about an opinion that they hold, which typically those are the ones that we hold with passion. So this is why I'm saying there's a correlation there. They will be way less likely to change this particular opinion, but still much more than people. 24 problems. And these 24 problems had different distributions. And as I said, we worked on this problem. We ran this like on tens of thousands of subjects to get exactly where problems were kind of in the border. Like we played with the parameters in each of these particular cases. So because you move small nuances of the problem and then people begin to agree or to disagree. And we try to tune them to be in a situation where people were evenly split between yes and not. But even then there was different degrees of polarization. Some problems, like there were not people in the middle, were very polarized, and other problems, they were less polarized. And we had 24 problems, and in the quite interesting, and the best predictor of the problems that we call passionate problems, where people will not agree and where they were polarized, had to do with if they had some or not. Problems which, and this was a very general thing, a very general consideration. But it seems as if this would be, I mean, once again, this is what we found in the data, and it was hard. If we ask people beforehand which are the ones where they think people will be more polarized, once again, people's intuitions are not completely right on this. And this is because I think you're right on thinking that it has to do with the passion we confront a problem with. But of course, the passion we confront a problem with is very different for different people. So some people, like if I ask you, so one typical problem of morality, for instance, to give you an example, is you are very hungry on a situation and you're starving and you decide to eat your dog. And the question is this right or is this wrong? And once again, it's an issue of priorities. I mean, do we have right to eat meat? Do we have right, but why some meats and not other meats? What are the necessities and the situations of extraordinary circumstances in which people have the right? And for some people, this is an incredibly passionate problem, either in favor or against. But for a lot of people, this is a problem that does not engage a lot of passion. So it's I think you're right on understanding that this has to do with the passion, but it also has to be understood that it's not easy to predict for whom will end up being very passionate problems or not. And so this is, as I said, one thing that has come out as something which was difficult to measure. The result, yet to say once again, is that in all problems, in every single problem, people agreed much more than they think. There were other
Thank you,
questions in
sir.
the chat. Yeah. Sorry, you said
No.
something. And
No, thank you so much. Just one more follow-up, again, a little detail, but I'm just trying to understand how you collected this data. How did you ensure diversity in your groups? Did you conduct like a pre-study to see what their opinions are on similar problems and then decided the groups?
Yeah.
How does that
No,
work?
we the groups we did not decide it. So the way this experiment was done in 2 steps. In the first step, we gave problems to people, and these problems had different parameters. So let me give you an example. So at 2 months, at 4 months, at 6 months, or abortion could be for different reasons. It could be just because I want, or because there's a medical reason, or because there was violation. You can imagine. We sampled problems until we found a situation in which, for the particular public in which we're doing this experiment, which was Argentinians, young, between 20 and 50, and so on, with a certain degree of education, that for our sample, these problems we calibrated them so that they were more or less evenly split. And this was important because if we gave a problem and that everyone agreed beforehand, then it was not interesting because the conversation, there was nothing to speak. Like my entire crowd will have the same opinion. So that's how we calibrated the problems. Like for each moral problem, we moved the parameters and we ran an experiment with like 15,000 people, like a very large experiment, where we identified the points in which these decisions were of different opinions. And then once we did that in the experiment, the groups were random. So we had a very large crowd of 10,000 people. We randomly placed them in groups. And so these groups were heterogeneous. Sometimes they were like 2 women and 1 man. Sometimes they were like 3 men. Sometimes they were 1 person of 50, 1 person of 20, and 1 person of 33. Sometimes there were 3 people that more or less believed the same thing. Sometimes there were 2 very against and 1. We had so much space, and then we could regress, as I showed you, what different configurations lead more to agreement or to disagreement. And that's how we end up with the study that I show you, that when in situations where there's a lot of tension, there's more agreement when you have a high confidence grade within the group. Okay, so I'll read a few more questions in the chat if you think this, let me go. So let me see some questions for now. This might be something you spoke just now, but can you, oops, sorry, I said I could read the chat. So Sophia asks, some groups also come to decisions without any basis in reality or rational discourse to commit acts of violence. Oof.
Yes, hello. I mean, like what we just saw in the US, but not only that, I mean, throughout history, there have always been groups that were radical, and that kind of, the group members were radicalized by being members of the group. Yeah. And their decision making is not based on any facts or reality or any rationality, really. Yeah. So the group's opinions become stronger and stronger until they think, oh, this is the best idea to commit acts of violence like riots or something. Yeah.
Okay. So important and difficult question. I'll tell you 2 things. First is the groups, I mean, the fact that, so I gave a story where I said groups, when they get together, they become more rational, they tend to converge to better decisions. And I mentioned something which now you're bringing again, and I think it's very important to put it on the table, which is often groups just get delirant, and they get together and they do this kind of, they get mad. And there's a story of this. There's a famous book and a famous result and a famous paper by the English mathematician and generally scientist. It's an interesting scientific story. He wanted to show that for the decisions, the thing to do, not to ask a lot of stupid people, but to ask a single expert. Because his idea was that a lot of aggregated stupidity would not lead to intelligence. And so he did this famous experiment in which he had a bull and he asked people to give an estimate of the weight. And then he asked the crowd was, I mean, they were all ignorance, they did not know about the problem, so their average would be very wrong. And what he found, to his surprise, and it's an interesting story of how a scientist can change his mind in this particular case, was that the crowds on average were much more wiser and with better results than the most significant expert. And this became a very famous sentence, which is the wisdom of the crowds. The idea that if you aggregate human knowledge, eventually you will clean mistakes by noise and you will get very good results. This is true in some problems, but then a lot of people also a long time ago found that this, in many situations, this is far from true, and it can be the other way around. And there is a very famous book also, Madness of it. And this goes more to the idea of that for statistical thinking to be effective, what you need is entities to be independent. So a typical error in statistics is I have two samples, so I just correlated because they were essentially the same. I like really only have one sample. So when you get people and these people start talking to each other, they start to become self-similar. And so you lose statistical significance. And so this is the idea that when you have very large groups, what happens is that they tend to agree on themselves. This is called echo chambers also. It's a space where people are producing the same resonant thoughts. And as you mentioned also, sometimes you have spark figments of ideas that may be more or less attached to reality. You're claiming that there's no attachment to reality. I would like to discuss this in a second. But for now, regardless of whether these ideas do have a certain attachment of reality, they become enhanced, they become prioritized, they become a single voice, and people get very convinced about this. And this is like the opposite result to what I showed. Are diverse, that are rational, that have, and they go into a group, and in this group they lose all their rationality. What is the main difference between what I said and what you just mentioned? In my view, it's essentially the size of the group. When you get, there are other things which have to do with the organization of how people speak. But in general, you get this kind of result when you're in situations in which people cannot speak their mind, because there are many, because space is not enough, because there's one that speaks a lot, because there's one that speaks very well. There's a preacher that has a capacity of expressing words with great brilliance that somehow enshadows all of the other people and convinces all of them. So it can be different things. Number, I think it's the first and most relevant one, but of course there are other ones, which makes people be in a situation where instead of sharing opinions, they're absorbing opinions. And that's the only thing that they can do. So this is, of course, well known. This is another phenomenon. And this is like many situations in human psychology or in the frontier between and social science, where it's very important to understand that you may observe this. It may converge on one way or it may converge in the other way. Groups, I began saying what you just expressed, the idea that conversation converges to madness, is something we are very used to now. And I wanted to confront this idea by saying it doesn't need to be like this. we find many situations in which it's the other way around, in which, and there are numerous of these situations. And so, which is why what makes some people talk and eventually become more reasonable, and what makes some people talk and eventually become more unreasonable. And so, once again, I would like to claim the freedom of the group and the comfort of the group are key variables for these elements. Once again, this goes on the idea, these tensions of fear in the board, fire in the corridor. That's one situation. This one situation in which people become unreasonable, they hold to whatever view is being promoted, then they go to a different environment in which this same group actually can promote their rationality. So that's first argument. Second argument is, you mentioned explicitly they have no reason for that. And although I know it's not the easiest opinion I could hold, I would like to challenge this view, because I think it's not useful. I think it doesn't help. It's very easy to judge actions by other people when they do not agree to your standards as madness or as irrational. Typically, that's not how it is. Typically, these people do have a rational argumentation on principles that you and I may not share, but it's important to think that they're also reasoning, because that explains why they are so much convinced to what they are. To give the worst examples, like you can take Nazism, or you can... First, you have to understand that this phenomena is agreed by millions of people. So when this happens, you need to understand, and it's hard to argue that there are millions of idiots. Maybe it's the other way around, acceptable and sensible to being filtered to only some parts of information that actually will make us go to conclusions that in the light of other evidence may seem completely irrational. So let me give you an example which we've done on this. There's, as you may know, there's many organizations now that provide things like fact-checking. And they do so on the best of spirits, trying to make a discussion that will be more in politics and that will be more rational and less passionate, thinking that actually this will lead us to, to better judgment ultimately. And so we work with one of them in Argentina, and this in Argentina there is a very big polarization between two parties. One is called Perón, and the other one is that's against that. That's essentially the two political dimensions that we have. There's, you either are with one or you're against the other one. And it's extremely polarized, extremely, very vividly polarized. And so these fact checkers, what they do is that they show that sometimes, like, politicians on one side, they do things that are right, and sometimes they do things that are wrong, and politicians in the other side, sometimes they do things that are right, and they try to publish facts, regardless of what are your opinions. And they inject these facts into the social that will propagate to the idea of constructing a reasonable discussion and a reasonable conversation. Now, what happens is that, and in particular, this group has something like 1 million followers in Argentina, which is, at 3% of the population. It's a substantial amount of the population. Now, when you do the analysis, what we found is that people receive these facts directly from this fact-checking organism, but the majority of the people, they do not receive them directly from them. They receive them from someone that has sent it to them. And so what happens is, I think this is a very important idea. This organism produces facts that, like, let's say, those are like Democrat facts and those are Republican facts. Okay, those will show you that like the Republicans have done something that are right. Those will tell you that the Democrats have done something that are right as well. And so the idea is that you understand that it's not so much demons and devils, but it's people that are right and wrong, and eventually you'll temper your opinions and you'll become to more rational judgments. Now, what happens, you have your opinion, you think that there's one that's better and so on, but you'll understand that it's not black and white. It's like a kind of, people are more gray than we think. And so what happens is that, let's say, like the Republican tweets that they produce. What happens is that there is a huge tribe that's only sending these ones again. And if I'm a Republican, I will only receive these ones. I will not receive anything by that. So it's a kind of the Kahneman illusion of confirmation bias, but at the social level, because I'm only entered by people that think the way I think, and I only see tweets and facts and posts by people that think what I think. I'm constantly being sent information that gives, and I'm not even conceiving the other ones. So if I'm in this camp, this is what I would like to convey. It's not that I'm irrational. I'm seeing arguments which exist, which are only a part of the arguments, many of them that should be completely discredited by arguments which are on the other side. And I am making conclusions. So to give an example, people that are against vaccines, there are reasons to be against the vaccine, and they do have a risk, but they have a benefit, and you have to see both arguments, and when you see both arguments, you come to a rational discussion. If you only see one part of the story, you will, it's not like it's irrational. It is rational based only on the elements of the story that you wanted to see. So in my opinion, and I'm saying my opinion because I don't think there's grounded evidence for this, but all the sensing of the evidence that I've seen, people are almost always doing rational conclusions to the thing to the ideas that they hold with very strongly. And they have arguments for things that you could never imagine that there may be an argument for that. There are single things. I mean, there's always an argument for killing someone. The thing is that there are other arguments for not killing this person, and this argument is more important in this confrontation. But you can always think of arguments for why you would do something. So I know it's provocative, and it may seem may not be the first idea that comes to mind, but I think it does help even when you find the most remarkable corners of human madness to try to make of what process of reasoning they may have done and not just credit them as idiots or irrational or fanatic tribal monkeys, but think there are people that are observing a different aspect of the universe. And from this aspect of the universe, they're making the conclusions. I'm not saying this not to judge. I'm not saying that we should allow, once again, I'm just saying that in the position of understanding, we're in a more powerful position to eventually change these things in the way we would like. I would to confront it seem completely irrational, they may have some aspects of rationality. I think we are on time also. Maybe, I don't know, Sid, how you want to handle this.
You know what, Mariano, let me end this with deep thanks, really edifying, high level, super interesting talk. And I'd like to end with a little Mariano story. I'll start off with an experiment. And the experiment had to do with, in the social sciences, social cognition.
We lost you, Sid, I think. I don't know if the other people are listening to you, but I am not.
No, you got.
And it had to do with selective perception. Okay, so in the video that was shown to people in this study, there were people with black t-shirts, passing a ball back and forth among each other, and touch the ball. And so people were dressed in a gorilla outfit, walked in the middle of were passing the balls back and forth, and exited. And then people were asked, did you see gorilla? And a really small percentage of the people saw the gorilla. And there are all kinds of reasons why they did that. Now I'm going to shift the story to another thing. I saw a wonderful movie.
Sid, we can't hear you.
Argentinian movie called Wild Tales in a Mariano view. You can't hear it? Mariano? Thank you.
Thank you, Sid, and thank you all. Great pleasure to be there. See you soon.
Brazzo.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Yes, thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.